Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into respondent conditioning. It's this really cool way our brains learn to react to the world around us.
Yeah. And it's not just about rewards and punishments. It's about, what happens before an action can, kind of make us respond in certain ways.
It's almost like our brains are playing a game of guess what happens next.
Exactly. By the end of this deep dive, I guarantee you'll start seeing it everywhere, all the time.
Okay, I'm already intrigued. We've got some really fascinating examples from a behavior modification textbook, some stuff about toy factories, and even a baby named Little Albert.
Ah, yes, Little Albert,
You know.
classic study. Though a bit ethically questionable, by today's standards.
Right.
But it really highlights how powerful respondent conditioning can be, especially when it comes to, our emotions. But we'll get to that later. First, let's lay the groundwork.
Okay, sounds good. Let's break down those respondent conditioning basics. I know there are some technical terms involved, so feel free to walk us through it.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with understanding the core elements. Just think of it like a recipe. You have your ingredients.
Okay, I like where this is going.
So you have your unconditioned stimulus, or US, which is something that naturally triggers a response without, any prior learning.
Okay, so it's like a built-in reaction.
Exactly. And then there's the unconditioned response, or UR, which is that natural automatic reaction to the US.
So using one of the examples from the source material, if someone blasts air in your face, that air blast would be the US, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then that natural reaction to blink would be the UR.
You got it. Now, imagine there's a, clicking sound that always happens right before the air blast. Initially, that clicking sound is a neutral stimulus, or NS. It doesn't mean anything special. But through, repeated pairings with the air blast, it becomes a conditioned stimulus, or CS.
So basically the brain starts to anticipate the air blast whenever it hears the click.
Exactly. And that anticipation leads to the conditioned response, or CR, which is, the learned reaction to the now conditioned stimulus.
Okay, so in this case, the person might start blinking at the sound of the click even before the air hit their face. Their brain has learned to associate the click with the puff of air.
Precisely. It's like the brain is creating a shortcut, click equals blink.
It's fascinating how the brain can make those connections, sometimes without us even realizing it.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another really crucial aspect of respondent conditioning: timing.
Okay, I'm sensing this is important.
It is. The way these stimuli are presented in time, significantly impacts how strong that association becomes.
Timing is everything, right? Like in comedy.
Exactly. But in respondent conditioning, there are different ways these stimuli could be timed, which, directly affects the learning process.
Makes sense. So what are the different ways these stimuli can be timed?
Well, the textbook lays out 4 main ways. The most effective is delay conditioning, where the neutral stimulus, like our clicking sound, overlaps a bit with the unconditioned stimulus, the air blast.
Okay, so the brain has a short window to connect the two. What about the other types?
Right. So then you have trace conditioning. And in trace conditioning, the neutral stimulus ends completely before the unconditioned stimulus occurs. It still works, but the longer that gap, the weaker that association tends to be.
It's like trying to remember a phone number after only hearing it once.
Exactly. I always have to repeat those numbers over and over before I can dial them.
Me too. What are the other ways?
Well, then you have simultaneous conditioning, where the NS and US happen at the exact same time.
Okay.
This one is pretty ineffective because the NS doesn't really predict the US,
Yeah, that makes sense. If the smoke alarm went off at the exact same time you smelled smoke, it wouldn't be very helpful in preparing you.
Exactly. And lastly, we have backward conditioning, where the unconditioned stimulus actually comes before the neutral stimulus.
Interesting.
This one, it almost never works.
Yeah.
It's like trying to learn from the past instead of, predicting the future.
It seems like our brains are wired for anticipation, always trying to figure out what's coming next.
Exactly. So timing is crucial. But there's that one quirky exception we discussed earlier, taste aversion. Yeah. And it's interesting how it seems to, defy the rules of timing.
Yeah, it's so weird how taste aversion can happen even with a significant time gap between eating something and getting sick.
It is. It suggests a powerful evolutionary mechanism to protect us from harmful substances.
I've definitely experienced this. I once had some, I think it was bad shrimp. And even though it took hours to get sick, the mere thought of shrimp still makes me queasy. It's like my brain overrode the time gap just to be safe.
Right. Seems our brains prioritize avoiding things that could potentially harm us, even if the association isn't immediate. But getting back to our examples, I think it's time we introduce poor Julio and his not-so-pleasant tunnel experience.
Oh, yes, Julio. I'm ready to hear about his story and how it all ties into this.
Okay, so picture this, right? It's late, Julio's walking home, and he has to go through this dimly lit tunnel under the train tracks. Not exactly a, relaxing stroll.
Especially because the textbook mentions some creepy encounters happening in that tunnel, rats, threatening teenagers, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Now imagine Julio experiences these scary events like multiple times. His heart races, his muscles tense up, he starts breathing rapidly. This is his unconditioned response to a stressful situation, that natural fight or flight response kicking in.
So the scary events themselves are the unconditioned stimulus in this scenario.
You got it. But here's where it gets interesting, right? After a while, just, approaching the tunnel, even when nothing bad is happening, starts triggering those same fear responses in Julio.
So the tunnel itself becomes the conditioned stimulus, even if it's like perfectly safe at that moment. His brain has linked the tunnel to those past scary experiences.
Exactly. This illustrates how our environment can become a powerful trigger for emotional responses based on our past experiences. Poor Julio might find himself like dreading that walk home every night, even if the tunnel is perfectly safe.
It's like his brain is saying, danger zone, proceed with caution. I'm starting to think about all those times I felt, a rush of anxiety or excitement and never really understood why. It's like my own personal tunnel situation playing out. But we'll get to that personal reflection a little later.
Yes, I think that's a great idea. We'll come back to that. But for now, let's dive into another layer of complexity: higher order conditioning.
Ooh, that sounds intriguing. What is higher order conditioning? Is it like conditioning on steroids?
You could say that. It shows us that a conditioned stimulus doesn't always need to be directly paired with an unconditioned stimulus.
Okay.
It can be built on top of an existing conditioned stimulus. So let's go back to Julio and that tunnel.
Oh no, poor Julio is back in that tunnel.
Just for this example, now imagine that every time Julio approaches a tunnel, there's a street musician always playing a certain song. Let's say a jaunty polka tune.
Okay, so we have the tunnel, which is the original conditioned stimulus triggering Julio's fear. Now we're adding this new element, the polka music, which is like consistently paired with the tunnel experience.
Right. What do you think might happen over time?
Well, if I'm applying what we've learned, could Julio start associating the polka music with the tunnel and develop a fear response to the song itself, even when he's nowhere near the tunnel?
Precisely. The polka music, initially a neutral stimulus, becomes a conditioned stimulus through its association with the tunnel, which was already a conditioned stimulus. It's like building a chain of associations.
That's wild. It's like our brains are constantly creating these webs of associations, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. This gave me a whole new perspective on why seemingly random things can sometimes trigger strong emotions in me.
Exactly. And speaking of emotions, that brings us to the heart of respondent conditioning. Conditioned emotional responses, or CERs.
Okay, let's dive into CERs. I'm really curious about how our emotions get tied into all of this.
Well, our emotions are like powerful, unconditioned responses to various things in our lives. We jump for joy when we see loved ones. We feel fear when we encounter danger. And these emotional responses, just like physical reflexes, can become conditioned to new stimuli. And the textbook uses that famous, though ethically problematic, example of little Albert to illustrate this.
Oh yes, little Albert. I think I remember hearing about this experiment. It's the one with the baby and the rat, right?
That's the one. It's a classic example of how a conditioned emotional response can be created. But again, it's important to remember that the ethics of this study are highly questionable by today's standards.
Understood. But for the sake of learning about CERs, let's hear about little Albert and what happened to him.
So little Albert was this happy, healthy baby who initially wasn't afraid of anything, including this white rat that the researchers introduced. The rat was like a neutral stimulus for him.
Okay, so no pre-existing rat phobia for little Albert.
Right. But the researchers, they wanted to see if they could create a fear response. So whenever they presented the rat to Albert, they would They would simultaneously make a very loud, startling noise, like by striking a metal bar.
Ooh, that sounds terrifying. That sudden loud noise would definitely be a strong unconditioned stimulus for a fear response, especially for a baby.
Exactly. And that's exactly what happened. Little Albert would cry and show signs of distress, which is, a natural unconditioned response to that frightening noise. But after just a few pairings of the rat and the noise, guess what happened when they presented the rat alone?
Knowing what we know about respondent conditioning, I'm going to guess that Albert started showing that same fear response to the rat alone, even without the noise.
You got it. The white rat, which was initially neutral, had become a conditioned stimulus for fear. Little Albert had developed a phobia of their furry little creature.
Wow, that's a powerful, though upsetting example of how respondent conditioning, especially when it comes to our emotions, can have such a strong impact.
It really highlights how our early experiences can, shape our emotional responses later in life.
Huh.
And while this experiment focused on creating a negative CER, it's crucial to remember that we also develop positive CERs.
Right. It's not all fear and phobias. We learn to love, feel joy, and get excited about things too, like how certain scents can trigger, warm feelings of nostalgia because they're associated with happy childhood memories.
Exactly. Or how a particular song can make your heart soar because it was playing during, a special moment. These sights, sounds, and even smells become cues for our brains to release those feel-good chemicals.
It's amazing how our brains can link those sensory experiences to emotions. Think about it. What are your positive, negative CERs? What are those triggers that instantly bring up certain emotions?
That's such a great point. I'm already thinking about my own personal triggers. The smell of freshly baked bread that reminds me of my grandma's kitchen, or a certain song that always makes me feel happy. It's incredible how these associations are woven into the fabric of our lives. But what happens if we want to change these learned emotional responses? That's where the concept of respondent extinction comes in.
Ooh, respondent extinction. Tell us more about that. Is it possible to break those CSCR links, especially when it comes to things like, fear and anxiety?
Absolutely.
Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. Respondent extinction is basically a process that weakens the connection between a conditioned stimulus, that trigger, and the conditioned response.
Okay.
It happens when the CS is presented repeatedly, but without the unconditioned stimulus that originally caused that reaction.
So using Carla's example from the toy factory, it would be like fixing the machine so the air blast no longer follows the clicking sound.
Yeah, yeah.
The click keeps happening, but no more puff of air.
Exactly.
Eventually, her brain might learn, okay, that click doesn't equal danger anymore.
That's a great way to put it. Essentially, the brain is learning a new association.
Mm.
The click is no longer a reliable, predictor of the air blast. And in Julio's case, respondent extinction would involve repeatedly walking through that tunnel, but without encountering those scary events.
So the tunnel, the CS, is present, but the US, those frightening experiences, they don't happen.
Exactly.
I see what you mean. So basically, it's about exposing yourself to the trigger, but without the negative consequence.
Precisely. And over time, the fear response should diminish. But I get what you're thinking. It's easier said than done, especially with those strong emotional responses.
Exactly. It's easy for us to say, Julio should just keep walking through the tunnel, but what if he can't bring himself to do that? Those fear responses can be so powerful. Are there more realistic ways to approach this?
Yeah. You bring up a really important point. Extinction can be, it can be challenging, especially when those emotional responses are deeply ingrained. That's why therapists often use techniques that build on this principle,
Yeah.
but make it more manageable. For example, they might start by having Julio imagine the tunnel, but in a safe, controlled setting.
It's like dipping your toes in the water before jumping in the deep end.
Exactly. Or they might use gradual exposure, starting with just standing near the entrance of the tunnel and then slowly working up to walking through it.
It's like baby steps for the brain, relearning that the trigger isn't always followed by something scary.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And this brings up another interesting concept related to to extinction. Spontaneous recovery.
Ooh, spontaneous recovery. That sounds kind of ominous.
Yeah.
Tell us more about it.
So let's say, Julio, he puts in the work and successfully extinguishes his fear of the tunnel, right? He's like walking through it with no problem. But then out of the blue, that old anxiety comes creeping back.
Oh, no. So does that mean, like, all that effort was wasted?
No, not at all. Spontaneous recovery is it's actually a normal part of the extinction process. It means that after a period of time, the conditioned response, in this case Julio's fear, it might briefly reappear.
So it's like a little blip on the radar.
Yeah.
A reminder that those old associations are still lurking somewhere in the brain.
Precisely. The good news is that that with spontaneous recovery, the fear response is usually weaker and fades away more quickly than before. And with continued exposure to the CS without the US, those spontaneous recoveries become less frequent until ideally the fear is gone for good.
Okay, that's reassuring. It sounds like extinction, even with those little hiccups of spontaneous recovery, can be a real path to to unlearning those unwanted conditioned responses.
It can.
It might take time and effort, but it's possible.
It is, and it's important to remember that everyone is different.
Yeah.
Some people might experience quicker results than others. It often depends on things like how strong the initial fear was and how long it's been present.
That makes sense. So we've talked about how conditioned responses can be extinguished, but what about how they spread or stay specific to certain triggers? Earlier you mentioned generalization and discrimination. Can you explain those concepts?
Of course. Generalization and discrimination are they're all about how broadly or narrowly a conditioned response applies. Let's use the example of a fear of dogs, which often develops through respondent conditioning.
I can definitely see how a negative experience with a dog could create a conditioned fear response.
Absolutely. Now imagine someone is bitten by a large aggressive German Shepherd. If they then develop a fear of all dogs, regardless of size or breed, that's generalization. The conditioned response has spread to a whole category.
So it's like their brain is saying all dogs are potentially dangerous.
Right, but if that person only fears German Shepherds or even just large dogs that look similar to the one that bit them, that's discrimination. The conditioned response is it's specific to a particular type of dog.
So generalization is a wide net of fear.
Yeah.
And discrimination is more like a laser focus on a specific trigger.
That's a great way to put it. And these concepts, they apply to all kinds of conditioned responses, not just fear. Think about food preferences. Maybe you love a specific brand of chocolate chip cookies but aren't crazy about others. That's discrimination. But if you love all cookies, well, that's generalization.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. So whether a conditioned response generalizes or stays specific, it depends on a few things, right? How similar the original conditioned stimulus is to other stimuli.
Exactly. If the original CS is distinctive and other stimuli are quite different, discrimination is more likely. But if the CS shares many features with other things, then generalization becomes more probable.
This is making me think about my own my own fears and preferences. I'm only afraid of spiders with really long legs, but my friend is terrified of any spider, big or small. That's a perfect example of discrimination versus generalization.
It is. And this awareness can be really helpful. By understanding these concepts, we can start to pinpoint those specific triggers and determine whether our fears or aversions are truly warranted or if they've spread beyond their original context.
This whole conversation is really making me think about how much is happening beneath the surface of our awareness. It's like respondent conditioning is this this hidden force shaping so much of what we feel and do. But before we get too lost in the world of clicking sounds and scary tunnels, I remember you mentioning there are several factors that influence how strongly conditioning works in the first place. Can you remind us what those are?
Of course. The source material outlines 5 key factors.
Okay.
First, there's the intensity of the unconditioned stimulus and the and the neutral stimulus.
Yeah.
The stronger the US, the more likely it is to like create a strong conditioned response.
That makes sense. Going back to Carla, a gentle puff of air probably wouldn't have resulted in such a dramatic blinking response.
Exactly. A more intense US is likely to create, a more intense fear response as well.
Yeah.
And the intensity of the neutral stimulus plays a role too. Like a faint clicking sound might go unnoticed, but a loud, sharp click is more likely to grab attention and become associated with the US.
It's like the more attention grabbing the neutral stimulus, the easier it is for the brain to like latch onto it as a predictor of what's to come.
Exactly. And then of course we have timing.
Correct.
Which we've already discussed. The way those stimuli are presented in time is it's crucial for forming that association.
Right, timing is everything. Okay, what's next?
Next we have contingency, which refers to like how consistently the neutral stimulus predicts the unconditioned stimulus. If the click always precedes the air blast, that connection is going to be much stronger than if it only sometimes leads to the air blast.
So the more reliable that predictor is, the faster and more strongly the conditioning, occurs. It's like our brains are like always trying to figure out, which cues are worth paying attention to.
That's a great way to think about it. The brain is constantly like looking for patterns and, making predictions. And then we have the number of pairings. Mm-hmm. Generally, the more times the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are presented together, the stronger the conditioned response will be.
Okay.
But those initial pairings, they're the most powerful, with each subsequent pairing having, slightly less impact.
So it's like the brain is saying, okay, I'm getting it. Click me air blast. You don't have to, you don't have to keep showing me.
Right. The association becomes stronger with repetition, but it reaches a point of diminishing returns. And finally, we have previous exposure to the neutral stimulus. This refers to like how familiar something is before it gets paired with the US. The example from the textbook was about a dog named Newt who had never done anything to hurt a child named Grace.
I remember that example.
So because of that, that consistent safe exposure, it's unlikely that Newt would become a CS for fear, even if he like accidentally knocked her down.
Okay.
But if you did the same thing to someone meeting him for the first time, they might develop a fear of Newt based on that that single negative experience.
Because they lack that history of positive interactions.
Exactly. That prior exposure creates a sense of safety and familiarity, making it less likely for something to become associated with fear.
Okay, those 5 factors really paint a comprehensive picture of how respondent conditioning works. It's like understanding the recipe for learning, knowing, which ingredients and techniques lead to the strongest associations. But I think it's important to remember that respondent conditioning isn't the only learning game in town, right?
Right.
Earlier, we touched on the difference between, respondent and operant conditioning. Can you remind us about that distinction? I know it can be a little, tricky to keep them straight.
You're absolutely right. They both involve, learning, but they focus on different aspects of behavior. Respondent conditioning, as we've been exploring, is all about those automatic responses triggered by stimuli that come before the behavior. It's about like those innate reactions and how they become associated with with new triggers.
So it's like our reflexes and emotions being shaped by what we experience.
Precisely. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, is all about the consequences of our actions. It's like how we learn to do things based on the rewards or punishments that follow.
It's like if I reach for a cookie and get a delicious treat, I'm more likely to reach for a cookie again in the future.
Exactly. It's learning through trial and error. Behaviors that lead to pleasant consequences are more likely to be repeated, and behaviors that lead to unpleasant consequences are less likely to be repeated. And the textbook offers a great example of how both types of learning can happen simultaneously. Remember that crow we talked about earlier?
The one that swooped down and startled that poor kid.
Yes. So on the respondent conditioning side, you have the crow's loud screech, the unconditioned stimulus, causing the child to feel fear. The unconditioned response, after a few encounters, the sight of a crow The conditioned stimulus might be enough to trigger that, that same fear response, the conditioned response, even if the crow, doesn't make a sound.
So that's how a phobia can develop, even if the crow never actually harms the child.
Right. But there's also operant conditioning happening here. Imagine that that after the crow scares the child, they run to their parent for comfort.
Okay.
The parent soothes the child, making them feel safe and secure.
That's a lovely image. But how does this tie into operant conditioning?
Well, the child's behavior of running to their parent is being reinforced by that positive consequent, the comfort and security that they receive. They're learning that seeking their parent out when scared, it leads to good things.
So in a way, they're learning a coping mechanism for that conditioned fear response. It's like two different learning systems working in tandem.
Exactly. And this interplay happens all the time. Our actions are they're shaped by both the things that happen before them and the consequences that follow.
This is making me think about how much of our behavior is influenced by factors we're not even consciously aware of. It's a whole new way of looking at myself and others. Can you give another example of respondent and operant conditioning working together? Maybe something a little less scary than Krenz this time.
Sure. Think about a baby learning to love bath time. At first, the warm water might be a neutral stimulus, but if it's consistently paired with with gentle touches, playful splashing, and loving attention from parents, those all act as positive unconditioned stimuli, leading to feelings of joy and contentment.
So the bath itself, through association with those those good feelings, becomes a conditioned stimulus for happiness.
Exactly. Now imagine the baby while enjoying the bath accidentally splashes water.
Oh, God.
Creates this fun splashy sound. The parents might respond with laughter and encouragement, which acts as positive reinforcement for that splashing behavior.
So the baby learns that splashing leads to to fun reactions and is more likely to to splash again in the future. That's operant conditioning at play.
Precisely. We see respondent and operant conditioning intertwining to create this positive association with bath time.
I love that example. It's so much more heartwarming than scary crows.
Yeah.
But it really highlights how these two types of of learning are constantly shaping our experiences. Okay, dear listener, I challenge you. Can you spot respondent and operant conditioning happening in your own daily life now?
It's everywhere once you start paying attention.
We've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the fundamentals of respondent conditioning, how it shapes our our emotional responses, and how it differs from operant conditioning. And now I think it's time to take all of this knowledge and and apply it to our own lives.
How can I create those positive changes, build those healthier habits, and deepen my experience of joy? The possibilities are they're truly endless once you understand the power of respondent conditioning.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey of discovery. If it's sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to to listen back and let those concepts really sink in. And who knows, maybe this is just the beginning of your own exploration into the fascinating world of behavior change. Until next time, keep those brains firing and those learning lights on.